Hello, my friends. This is Dr. Beeder. Today is April 27, 1981, and this is my audio letter number 64.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. We've gone for main engine start. We have main engine start. America's first space shuttle, and the shuttle has cleared the tower.
And that's how it all began, my friends, just 2 weeks ago, Sunday, April 12, 1981. After years of delay, America's first attempt to launch a space shuttle into orbit had finally begun. In days gone by, the voice of Mission Control has always been a familiar hallmark of American manned flights into space. In the early days, beginning with Project Mercury, the voice was that of Colonel John Shorty Powers. Later, during the Apollo program, there were other voices. But regardless of who it was, that familiar voice of Mission Control would always stay with us throughout each space flight. That is, until this time. This time the voice of Mission Control up until the moment of launch was that of NASA spokesman Hugh Harris. The last words Harris spoke as the voice of Mission Control were the words you just heard: "The shuttle has cleared the tower." Television cameras followed the shuttle as it climbed higher and higher on a column of steam and smoke. For another 30 seconds or so we were allowed to hear the slowly fading roar of the shuttle's rocket engines. Then the sounds from Mission Control abruptly changed. Exactly 45 seconds after liftoff, live audio from Mission Control was terminated. In its place, NASA began feeding the radio and television networks an elaborate tape recording which had been prepared far ahead of time by NASA. The changeover from live audio to the NASA tape recording sounded like this.
Roger.
Just 45 seconds after liftoff, the falsified NASA coverage of the flight of the Columbia began. We were still able to see the Columbia by way of long-distance television cameras for another minute and a half, but the sounds we were hearing were no longer live. They were the sounds of the special NASA tape recording. For the first minute or so of the tape recording, we heard nothing but the sound effects simulating conversation between the shuttle and NASA Houston. Then for the first time we heard the anonymous new voice of Mission Control. It was no longer the familiar live voice of Hugh Harris, but the recorded voice of someone else. For added realism, the new voice was interrupted in turn by the recorded voice of the alleged capsule communicator Daniel Brandenstein. It sounded like this.
1 minute 45 seconds coming up on go, no, go. Columbia, your negative seat. That call up says that Columbia, the altitude is too high for ejection seat use.
By that point, the shuttle Columbia was more than 20 miles high and climbing fast. Everything was going according to plan so far, so the things we were hearing on the tape recording corresponded to what we were seeing. We could still see the shuttle on our TV sets, but it had dwindled to nothing more than 3 bright spots dancing in the distant sky. The last thing that you and I were able to see and verify for ourselves about the shuttle was the separation of those 2 giant solid rocket boosters. A little over 2 minutes after liftoff, we were able to watch the boosters, 2 burning bright spots, break off to each side. That left only the single tiny flame of the shuttle itself, gradually fading into invisibility. Several seconds later the NASA tape recording caught up with what we had already seen and said the boosters had separated. Moments later the tiny bright dot of the shuttle faded from our screens. It was too far away for the television cameras to follow any longer. We had had our last look at the real Space Shuttle Columbia. In AUDIO LETTER No. 62 2 months ago, I gave an advance alert about the secret military mission of the Space Shuttle Columbia. At that time I made public what the mission was really all about. I was also able to reveal what to expect in the falsified NASA coverage of the mission. The falsified coverage was designed to accomplish two purposes. First, to completely hide the military nature of the mission, and second, to make sure the mission looked like a total success, no matter what might happen in secret. As I detailed in AUDIO LETTER No. 62, the Bolsheviks here in the Federal Government are depending heavily on the Space Shuttle program to get ready for a nuclear war against Russia. The falsified NASA coverage of the mission of the Space Shuttle Columbia was carried out exactly according to plan. I revealed this plan 2 months ago. There were the standard brief cockpit scenes made by techniques which I will describe later. Just to make it look good, it was spiced up by telling us that a few non-critical tiles had fallen off. Otherwise we were told over and over how perfectly the Columbia was performing. 4 days ago, on April 23, a news conference about the flight was held in Houston, Texas by the alleged two astronauts, John Young and Robert Crippen. The entity called John Young summed up the flight in words that were more meaningful than most people suspected. Referring to the falsified flight which we followed on television, he called it, quote, "even better than normal," unquote. And so it was, my friends. The Bolsheviks who now control NASA bent over backwards to paint the image of an abnormally perfect shuttle flight. Meanwhile the actual shuttle mission, which was carried out in secret, did not go according to plan. After the shuttle disappeared from our television screens, the flight continued for barely 4 more minutes before disaster struck. The Columbia never even reached Earth orbit. My friends, I believe you have both the right and the need to know what happened to the Space Shuttle Columbia 2 weeks ago. I believe you deserve to know in detail how and why the truth was hidden from you. The stakes involve nothing less than the very survival of our land and our way of life. My 3 special topics for this AUDIO letter are: Topic number 1, the advanced preparations for the Space Shuttle mission. Topic number 2, the aborted flight of the Space Shuttle Columbia. And topic number 3, the NASA cover-up of the Columbia disaster. Topic number 1, there is an old saying that seeing is believing. For that reason, television has become the #1 tool of deception in America today. Through television we are made to see things we do not understand so that we will believe things that are not true. If television were used honestly and constructively, television could be a great force for good. Instead, it's used continually to hoax, deceive, and mislead us. Videotaping makes events which took place weeks or months ago look as if they were taking place live right before our eyes. Computer editing enables scenes to be spliced together to create completely artificial images that look real. Special effects of all kinds enable these television hoaxes to be very convincing indeed. 2 years ago I described one major television hoax in detail in AUDIO LETTER No. 44. That hoax involved no less than the NBC television news program Meet the Press. Now we have been treated to another great television hoax, and this one was the granddaddy of them all. In terms of sheer deception, this was the Meet the Press hoax, Guyana, and Skylab all rolled into one. This was the hoax coverage of the first flight of the Space Shuttle Columbia. To begin with, we were led to believe that until 2 weeks ago no space shuttle had ever left the Earth's atmosphere and gone into space. We were also led to believe that the very first space flight by a shuttle had to be an orbital flight instead of something less extreme. To make matters still worse, NASA swore up and down that this very first flight, pushing the shuttle to its limits, just had to have men aboard. At one point, even John Young himself was quoted to this effect very widely in the controlled major media. For example, 2 months ago on February 15, the New York Times carried a big article about the shuttle. Quoting from the article, Mr. Young said to have conducted an unmanned orbital flight of the shuttle first would have added perhaps $500 million to project costs and meant another year's delay." Unquote. Statements like that were cooked up purely to explain away the many things that did not add up about the announced plans for the Columbia's flight. Many people believed these explanations, but they were just a litany of lies. For example, time after time during the television coverage of the alleged flight this month, John Young's earlier statement was totally contradicted. Authoritative spokesmen pointed out over and over that the astronauts control the shuttle by telling computers aboard the shuttle what they want. The computers then do all the actual activation and control of the shuttle, and in an emergency the shuttle can fly itself into orbit, re-enter, and even land itself without help from the pilots. So much for all those lies NASA told us about an unmanned first flight being impossible. The real reason astronauts were aboard the first orbital flight was the one I revealed in AUDIO LETTER No. 62. It was a military mission, and the astronauts had to be aboard to carry it out. NASA told us that the flight this month was only a test flight, with the cargo bay practically empty. But the cargo bay of the Columbia was not empty. It carried a laser-armed spy satellite, equipped with special shields to protect it against Russian space weapons. But wait a minute, you say. They showed us live pictures from space, and you could see that the bay was empty. No, my friends, not live pictures, but videotapes. The pictures with the doors closed were taken inside a training mock-up of the shuttle that is carried inside a specially modified Boeing 747. The pictures with the doors open were taken on the ground, inside a darkened hangar. Then these scenes were combined by videotape editing techniques with videotapes of the Earth taken from orbit years ago. The final product was what you saw on television. It was not what it appeared to be, but seeing is believing. My friends, the next time you see a replay of those scenes with the shuttle doors open, supposedly in space, there is a telltale clue to look for. Look at the shadows visible inside the open cargo bay. Shadows in space tend to be sharp and harsh because there is no air to soften and diffuse them. The shadows we saw in the videotapes on television were softer because they were not made in space. Also, look at the angle of the shadows. The Earth is shown floating straight overhead, and it is all in daylight. Look at the slant of the shadows inside the open cargo bay. Then ask yourself, where is the light coming from to make shadows like that? The impossible shadows which we saw in the shuttle bay videotapes are just one small example of the many discrepancies in the NASA hoax. More to the point, NASA has pretended that the Columbia flight this month was the very first shuttle flight into space. We are supposed to believe that the only previous shuttle operations were a few gliding tests launched from mid-air by another modified 747. Nothing could be more ridiculous or more untrue. There is one very obvious question about the Space Shuttle program which NASA has always managed to sidestep. Somehow no one ever quite dares to ask it. The question is, why wasn't the Space Shuttle Enterprise the first to be sent into orbit? After all, the Enterprise made its public debut nearly 4 years ago in the summer of 1977. To all outward appearances, the Enterprise looks almost identical to its sister ship, the Columbia. The differences between the two are so subtle that you would never notice them unless you knew exactly what to look for. The engines of the Enterprise look just like the engines of the Columbia. The Enterprise is also covered with the same system of thermal tiles as the Columbia. So again, the question is, why wasn't the Enterprise sent into orbit long ago? Why did NASA wait 3 years and more to launch the Columbia instead? The answer, my friends, is that the Enterprise was designed to be a training ship for shuttle astronauts. It is not meant for orbital flight. Instead, it is specially equipped to make shorter suborbital flights into space. In effect, it can do everything short of going into Earth orbit. It can climb to orbital altitudes as high as 125 miles before dropping back to Earth. This enables astronauts to practice working in weightlessness for up to 5½ minutes at a time. It also allows astronauts to practice landing the shuttle, slowing down from speeds of around 5,000 miles per hour. The Enterprise is exactly like its sister ships in the crew compartment and cockpit. What makes the Enterprise radically different is the cargo bay area. The Enterprise cannot carry cargo because the bay area is taken up by rocket fuel tanks. The tanks of the Enterprise can hold well over 100,000 pounds of rocket fuel when fully loaded. To make a suborbital hop into space, the Enterprise is perched on top of a modified Boeing 747 known as the launch aircraft. Inside the 747 there are technicians with instruments and support equipment for the shuttle. The Shuttle Enterprise is loaded with rocket fuel and then the 747 takes off. At an altitude of around 40,000 feet, the shuttle is launched. The launch techniques are derived from the old days of the X-15 research airplane and others before it. The Enterprise is released from its mounts, rises up, and then falls back behind the 747. As soon as it is clear of the 747, the Enterprise starts its rocket engines and zooms upward at a steep angle. After a minute or so, the rockets shut off, and the Enterprise is left to coast upward to its peak altitude and then drop back toward Earth. From the moment the engines shut off until the shuttle begins re-entering the atmosphere 5 or 6 minutes later, the astronauts inside are weightless. Astronauts young and crippled made more than half a dozen training flights like this aboard the Enterprise before they lifted off aboard the Columbia at Cape Canaveral. That is why they were so ready to go all the way into orbit. They had already done everything else that was necessary to work their way up to it. Of course, other training was necessary to work their way up to those suborbital flights aboard the Enterprise. For one thing, they spent many hours in a detailed replica of the shuttle, which is housed inside a modified Boeing 747. The flying mock-up, as it is called, is a simulator designed to acquaint astronauts with shuttle operation as realistically as possible. One of its advantages is that it can even provide periods of weightlessness of up to about 45 seconds. The 747 pilot does this by flying a precise arc through the air called a parabolic trajectory. It's an old technique developed a quarter-century ago to help astronauts get accustomed to weightlessness. All of these things and more were originally conceived and developed for purely technical reasons, but they are being kept secret from you because the Bolsheviks who now control NASA have turned them into tools of deception against you and me. Lately, publicity about the Space Shuttle program has been focused on 3 geographic locations. One is the launch site for orbital missions. Cape Canaveral, Florida. Another is Edwards Air Force Base, California. The third is that old standby, the NASA Manned Space Flight Center in Houston, Texas. As always, we are being distracted from paying serious attention to the one area that is most important of all. It is the missing link, the true nerve center of the entire Space Shuttle program. My friends, I'm talking about the White Sands Missile Range in southern New Mexico. Most people today rarely give a second thought to White Sands. Few people remember that White Sands is where America's space program got its start after World War II. Captured German V-2 rockets were taken to White Sands to be studied and test-fired. After the V-2s, there were American rockets, the Navy's Viking series and others. They were launched, rocketed upward into the fringes of space, and came back to Earth, all within the boundaries of the vast White Sands Missile Range. One time a missile got out of control, veered south, and almost destroyed a small Mexican town when it crashed to Earth. But that incident was a dramatic exception to the normal situation. Most of the time, no one outside White Sands even knew when rockets were launched. Recently, the public has been made aware of the vast, wide-open spaces that constitute Edwards Air Force Base in California. For comparison, White Sands is so huge that it would hold nearly 100 Edwards Air Force bases. White Sands, my friends, is the training base for Space Shuttle pilots, and since late 1977 it has also become much more. It is the geographic key to the secret military missions which are now the central focus of the Space Shuttle program. The Shuttle program today is being managed in a way that is far different from the original plans. In August 1977, we were shown early gliding tests of the training shuttle Enterprise. The plan of NASA was to drum up public support for the Shuttle program, just as they had done a decade earlier in the Moon program. In AUDIO LETTER No. 26, I detailed how the Apollo program, the biggest military program in American history, was disguised as a peaceful scientific venture. In the same way, the original plan was to bathe the military shuttle program in the glare of deceptive publicity. In the process, we would have learned about the suborbital space capability of the Enterprise. Even the crucial White Sands would have received more publicity. What changed it all was the secret battle of the Harvest Moon in space, September 27, 1977. This secret space battle, which I made public that month in AUDIO LETTER No. 26, took place barely 1 month after the first gliding tests of the Space Shuttle Enterprise. Russia's military takeover of space was underway. Only the next month, October 1977, a newly operational Russian Cosmos interceptor shot down Skylab. Skylab, along with its crew of 5 American astronauts secretly aboard, died in a giant fireball over the United States. I reported on Skylab's fate that month in AUDIO LETTER No. 27, and also revealed that NASA was initiating a prolonged cover-up of what had happened. NASA wanted everyone to forget about that mysterious headline-making fireball. So they pretended that Skylab was still in orbit, but sinking unexpectedly. NASA used stories about the Space Shuttle as part of their Skylab cover-up. They pretended that perhaps the shuttle would come along in time to save Skylab. As I reported then, that was a double lie by NASA. First, Skylab could never be saved because it had already been destroyed. Second, the United States was in no position at that time to launch the shuttle or anything else of a military nature into space. Russia was deploying her secret new space triad of advanced manned space weapons. America's previous military control of space had been totally shattered by Russia. Our military base on the Moon had been put out of action in the Battle of the Harvest Moon. Russian Cosmos interceptors had started sweeping the skies clear of American spy satellites, and Russian hovering electrogravitic weapons platforms, the Cosmospheres, were making headlines by creating enormous air booms along the East Coast and elsewhere. All of these things took place just as America's Space Shuttle program was getting off the ground. The result was a complete reorganization of the Shuttle program. The old plans to bathe it in continuous publicity were thrown out. The Bolsheviks here, who have replaced the Rockefeller cartel in many areas of power, cast a net of secrecy over all these new military plans. We were never told about many of the capabilities of the training shuttle enterprise, and we were never told about the many things which are going on at White Sands in the military shuttle program. By keeping these things secret from us, the Bolsheviks here have placed themselves in a powerful position to deceive us. We have never been told about the modified NASA 747, which carries a complete replica of the crew quarters and cargo bay of a shuttle. Therefore, we are unaware that this airplane, originally intended for training, has become a Bolshevik tool of deception against us. When we saw videotapes of astronauts in the simulated shuttle cockpit, we naturally thought it was the real thing. Seeing a notebook float in mid-air for a few seconds next to the astronauts, we were supposed to think they are weightless because they are in orbit. We were given no clue that these moments of weightlessness had taken place months earlier in a 747 flying a controlled arc through the air. Likewise, we were shown one or two episodes of the astronauts moving around the cabin, obviously weightless, for up to 3 or 4 minutes. What we were not told is that these scenes had been videotaped months earlier during suborbital space hops by the training shuttle Enterprise. Many of my listeners have called or written with the same observation about the first of these episodes, shown the day of the launch. We heard the alleged live conversation of Young and Crippen, and yet in the television picture they were not moving their lips. They had merely posed for the camera during a suborbital flight months earlier, and they recorded the soundtrack we heard only days before the launch. While NASA may have fooled you and me about the Space Shuttle, they did not fool the new rulers of Russia. They learned last fall what the flight of the Columbia was really all about. And, my friends, when the Columbia was launched 2 weeks ago, the Russians were ready and waiting. Topic number 2. A month before the shuttle Columbia blasted off from Cape Canaveral, the 2 astronauts who were to ride in it held a news conference in Houston. The day was March 9, 1981. Astronaut Robert Crippen caught the attention of the reporters when he said, "I think the odds, with the way we've designed the mission right now, are that we will probably come home early." Unquote. Then he added, quote, "As far as John and I are concerned, if we get up and get down, it's a success." Unquote. Those words of astronaut Crippen about a short mission were more accurate than most people realized. The real mission plan, which I had already made public in AUDIO LETTER 62, was for a short mission. The astronauts were supposed to get into orbit and deploy the military satellite from the Columbia's cargo bay very quickly. Then they were to return to Earth, not aboard the shuttle, but in a special re-entry capsule. 2 days later they were supposed to land the disguised shuttle Enterprise at Edwards Air Force Base as the final act in the falsified drama staged for our benefit. In AUDIO LETTER 62 I described the military purpose of the mission in detail. For the first time in 3 years, the Pentagon was hoping to get a spy satellite into orbit that could not be shot down immediately by Russia. I also outlined important features of the flight plan which had been conceived for the Columbia. Now I want to give you more details about that and tell you how it turned out, because, my friends, the Bolsheviks here in the government are now planning to try it again with a second shuttle flight, presently scheduled for the fall of this year 1981. Knowing what happened this time, I believe you will be far better prepared to see through it all next time. If you can think back to American space launches of the past, you may have noticed something very unusual about the launch of the Columbia. In the past, manned space launches from Cape Canaveral have always been made toward the southeast, toward the equator, but not this time. The Columbia was launched to the northeast, away from the equator. The reason for this, my friends, was the secret space reconnaissance mission of the Columbia. In its public news releases, NASA told everyone that Columbia was launched into a 44-degree orbit. That is, it would never go further north or south than 44 degrees above and below the equator. But the actual orbit chosen for the Columbia was a 69-degree orbit. A 69-degree orbit was chosen because it would take the Columbia and the spy satellite inside it all the way north to the Arctic Circle and beyond. That is the kind of orbit that is necessary if a spy satellite is to fly reconnaissance over Russia. The northeast launch of the Columbia was done in order to enable the spy satellite to start gathering data over Russia only minutes after the Columbia reached orbit. These days, time is of the essence in any attempt to spy on Russia. Every American spy satellite launched at Russia during the past 3 years has been blinded or shot down before gathering much data. The secret flight plan for the Columbia was completely different from what NASA claimed in public. The plan called for Columbia to be launched on an initial northeast course in the general direction of Bermuda. Then, roughly 2½ minutes after launch, Columbia was to begin an unorthodox course change, a wide sweeping turn into the north. This unprecedented curving launch was intended as an evasive maneuver. Planners of the Columbia mission believed this would enable Columbia to sneak past any Russian cosmospheres that might be waiting overhead. Still accelerating on its curving course, the Columbia was supposed to pass about 100 miles east of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. Roughly 200 miles east of Washington, D.C., the shuttle's main engines were to cut off. After coasting in silence for a few seconds, the fuel tank was scheduled to cut loose as the Columbia passed 100 miles east of New Jersey. For the next 2 minutes, the shuttle and its fuel tank were to be coasting onward, past the east tip of Long Island, over Boston, and onward toward Maine. During that time, the shuttle was supposed to maneuver away from the fuel tank using small maneuvering jets. Finally, just as the Columbia passed over New Brunswick, Canada, the flight plan called for the orbital maneuvering engines to be fired. Somewhere over the Labrador Sea, flying upside down, the Columbia was scheduled to reach Earth orbit. As soon as it did so, the flight plan called for astronauts Young and Crippen to go to work fast. In less than 10 minutes' time, they were supposed to open up the cargo bay doors and turn on the sensors of the spy satellite resting inside. As they did these things, the Columbia was to be racing over the south tip of Greenland, out over the middle of the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland, above the Arctic Circle, and then dipping back southward toward northern Norway, Finland, and Russia. According to the flight plan, the Columbia was scheduled to cross the Russian border just south of the strategic Kola Peninsula. The time? A mere 22 minutes 42 seconds after liftoff from Cape Canaveral. At that moment, initial reconnaissance over Russia was to be underway. The spy satellite inside the cargo bay, even though not yet deployed, would have had a perfect view downward through the open doors of the upside-down shuttle. The Columbia was intended to fly over a course across Russia that began just west of the strategic White Sea in extreme northwestern Russia. From there, the planned course of the Columbia was to take it southeastward over some 2,500 miles of strategic Russian territory. During the first minute alone, the satellite was expected to see parts of the highly sensitive Kola Peninsula, the White Sea, including the super-secret submarine yards at Archangel and the Plesetsk Cosmodrome. The shuttle was also to pass near Kazan, one of the bases of Russia's flying ABM system. This system, as I revealed a year ago in AUDIO LETTER No. 54, uses charged particle beams carried by supersonic Tu-144 transports. Toward the end of the first pass over Russia, the spy satellite was expected to gather data on 2 more of Russia's 4 cosmodromes, those of Baikonur and Tyuratam. In between, numerous other war targets were also to come under scrutiny. The spy satellite in the Columbia's cargo bay was expected to see all that during its very first pass over Russian territory. It would all take only 8.5 minutes. Then the Columbia would have crossed the border with Afghanistan, heading toward India. Barely 10 minutes later, the spy satellite was to be radioing its data down to the American receivers at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. That was the plan, my friends. The Bolshevik military planners here were confident that their spy satellite would get at least this planned first look at Russia. They were sure that Columbia's curving launch and the short time involved would prevent Russia from thwarting the mission. Columbia took off from Cape Canaveral at 7 a.m. Eastern Time that Sunday morning. By 7:23, Columbia was expected to be over Russia already. By 7:31, Columbia was expected to be leaving Russian skies, and by 7:45 that Sunday morning, the military planners expected to have their first reconnaissance data from Russia. The plan sounded plausible, my friends, but the Bolsheviks here are falling victim to the very intelligence gap which they themselves created in America years ago. Russian intelligence agents were able to learn the general outlines of the Columbia mission plan some 6 months ago, fully 1 month before the public rollout of the Columbia at Cape Canaveral last November. The Russian Space Command was studying the problem. There was no question about one thing: the Columbia's mission could not be allowed to succeed. Given even a shred of up-to-date reconnaissance data, the Bolsheviks in America are determined to set off nuclear war. Even so, there was a question about the best way to spoil the shuttle mission. Several possibilities were considered, including sabotage or simply blasting the Columbia out of the sky. All were rejected because they shared one weakness. Each alternative would halt one shuttle mission, but it would not stop the shuttle program as a whole. And Russia's goal is to completely shut down the Space Shuttle program. At last they hit upon the solution. What was needed was a space-age version of the famous U-2 incident of 2 decades ago. In the waning days of the Eisenhower administration, Russia had publicly accused the United States of invading its airspace with spy flights. That was before the era of spy satellites, and invading other countries' airspace was a serious charge in the eyes of the world. American spokesmen tried to defuse the growing furor while carefully avoiding a definitive denial of the charges, but the Russians kept it up. Finally, President Eisenhower became so exasperated that he flatly denied in public that America was flying spy planes over Russia. That was exactly what the Russians were waiting for. The Russians promptly did what American intelligence specialists thought they could not do. They shot down a high-flying U-2 on a flight over Russia. The name of the CIA pilot, the late Francis Gary Powers, filled the headlines worldwide overnight. The Russians had made a liar of the President of the United States. A summit had been scheduled between President Eisenhower and Nikita Khrushchev, but the Russians icily called it off. The Russian Space Command proposed to the Kremlin that the Shuttle Columbia be made the focus of a similar incident. All that was necessary was that the Columbia be made to crash land in Russia reasonably intact. Having protested continuously about the military nature of the Shuttle program, Russia would be able to stun the world by proving it. They would put the crashed shuttle on public display, together with its nuclear-powered laser-firing spy satellite. The Kremlin liked the plan and agreed to it. To further emphasize the parallels with the 1960 U-2 incident, Russia has recently proposed a summit with the United States. The plan was to withdraw the summit proposal in protest after shooting down the Columbia. The Russian Space Command went to work several months ago to get ready. They were faced with a tall order to bring down the Columbia on Russian territory without totally destroying it. As recently as a year ago, it would have been an impossible task, but now Russia has a new space tool to do the job. It is the third version of the Russian levitating weapons platform, the Cosmosphere. They are called Super Heavies by the Russian Space Command. The Russian Super Heavy Cosmospheres are still considered experimental. Even so, the Russians have already built 7 of them. They are mammoth machines, the largest flying machines ever built. In terms of volume, they are even bigger than the biggest Zeppelins of the 1930s. They can carry a payload of more than 50 tons, far more than our own Space Shuttle, and they are equipped with powerful electromagnetic propulsion, which can take the Cosmosphere all the way to orbital speed. In short, my friends, the Jumbo Cosmosphere is Russia's Space Shuttle. It is still experimental, but it is operating already. In order to carry out their attack on the Space Shuttle Columbia, Russia's entire fleet of 7 Jumbo Cosmospheres were made ready. 5 were outfitted with special grappling equipment to enable them to seize a very large object in space. The other 2 were outfitted with neutron particle beam weapons. These weapons are the same type as were used in the Battle of the Harvest Moon in September 1977. At 7 a.m. Sunday morning, April 12, the rocket engines of the Space Shuttle Columbia roared to life. Moments later, the giant solid boosters were fired, and the Columbia took off fast. As it climbed, it rolled around and started leaning into its flight path toward space. As we watched on our television sets, it rapidly dwindled off into the northeast. We watched as the solid boosters separated and peeled away to each side. Moments later, the Columbia vanished from the screen. The television scene shifted to the alleged mission control in Houston. It was the old familiar scene with rows of mission controllers intent on their consoles. Up in front, the NASA computer-controlled map started tracing the alleged course of the Columbia. According to the map, Columbia was heading out over the Atlantic toward Bermuda. But at that moment, free of the solid boosters, Columbia was already starting its long sweeping curve to the north. 150 miles east of Charleston, South Carolina, Russia's fleet of 7 Jumbo Cosmospheres were hovering high over the ocean. As the Space Shuttle approached on its elaborate curving path, the Cosmosphere started speeding up to intercept it. The shuttle was already flying upside down with a huge fuel tank on top. The two cosmospheres, armed with neutron beams, closed in on the Columbia from below and slightly behind, where they could not be seen by Young and Crippen. The other 5 jumbo cosmospheres, with their grappling equipment, flew in formation above and well behind the fuel tank to be out of the line of fire. The cosmospheres paced the shuttle until it reached a predetermined altitude and speed. Then the armed cosmospheres opened up with their neutron beams, firing at point-blank range. Each cosmosphere fired just 2 bursts from its beam weapon. The first salvo flooded the cockpit area and an area near the engines in the rear. Young and Crippen died instantly, the neutron radiation having totally disrupted all activity of their nervous systems, brains, eyes, and hearts. At the same time, the shuttle's engines shut down. A fraction of a second later, the second salvo flooded neutron radiation into the nose and an area beneath the cargo bay. These shots were calculated to derange and shut down the Columbia's flight computers. That is, all the computers except one. The Russians wanted the backup computer to take over and do its job, that is, make an emergency automatic re-entry and crash landing in Russia. They anticipated that it would do so because the backup computer is heavily shielded against radiation. The shielding is a material more efficient than lead. It is gold. The Russians expected that the gold computer, as it is known in certain circles, would take over after the engines shut down. Sure enough, within 10 seconds after the engines shut down, the fuel tank, still a third full, was automatically cast loose. The gold computer was now flying the shuttle. The 5 jumbo cosmospheres with grappling equipment fastened onto the fuel tank. Then, using their powerful electromagnetic propulsion, they veered away with the tank. From its northeasterly course, the tank was swerved around over the North Atlantic in a great arc until it was heading southeast instead. The cosmospheres then accelerated to orbital speed and cast the fuel tank loose. 3 years ago, the first cosmospheres had sent a message by way of enormous air booms along America's east coast. Now Russia's newest cosmospheres were using the shuttle fuel tank to send a chilling new message to America's Bolshevik war planners. Meanwhile, the armed cosmospheres followed the Columbia itself. Having had its engines shut down prematurely, the Columbia was well below orbital speed. Instead, it was following a ballistic path, just like an ICBM, into the heart of Russia. It looked as though the Russian plan was going to work. But then the unexpected happened. One of Columbia's deranged computers apparently started working again. The brief shutdown had thrown it out of synchronization with the gold computer, so the 2 computers apparently did not communicate with one another. As the Columbia passed over the border of Russia, it was flying right side up instead of upside down, under control of the gold computer. But the other computer opened up the cargo bay doors right on schedule. As the shuttle began to re-enter over Russia, hot air flooded the cargo bay. Heat sensors in the spy satellite detected the heat buildup, which was programmed into the satellite's computer as a sign of attack damage. Finally, the temperature built up to a critical point, activating a self-destruct circuit in the satellite. The spy satellite exploded, blowing the Columbia apart. The Russians had hoped for a crash landing in recognizable form. Instead, the Columbia ended up in wreckage strewn along a line some 85 miles long in central Russia, southeast of the city of Kazan. As it turned out, neither the Bolsheviks here nor the Russians got what they wanted. The Bolsheviks did not get their reconnaissance data, and the Russians did not get a recognizable space shuttle to show the world. That leaves the stage set for another try by both sides later this year. Topic number 3. Sunday, April 12, 1981 was the 20th anniversary of the first manned flight into space. It was the anniversary of the first orbital flight by a Russian cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin. It was also a day of total disarray among the Bolshevik masters of America's Space Shuttle program. Less than 8 minutes after launch that Sunday morning, they knew something had happened to the Columbia. You and I were still hearing the sound effects of a seemingly successful flight courtesy of the NASA tape recording from Houston, but the military controllers at White Sands, who were following the real flight, were hearing nothing at all. Columbia had suddenly gone totally silent. At 7:45 a.m. the news got worse. Columbia had failed to arrive over the Indian Ocean on schedule. Before the morning was out, there was still more bad news. NORAD was tracking the fuel tank of the shuttle. It was not supposed to be in orbit at all, but there it was, in an orbit that looked impossible. That evening, Sunday, April 12, the shuttle's fuel tank re-entered over the Gulf of Mexico just south of Louisiana. The tank had ruptured, but there was still a sizable amount of liquid hydrogen and oxygen inside. When the tank re-entered, it heated up and set off an enormous explosion, creating a giant cloud at the fringes of space. Gold plating, which is used extensively in the shuttle fuel tank because of its heat transfer properties, was vaporized and scattered through the cloud. The result was the same as when gold is added in tiny quantities to stained window glass, a brilliant pinkish-red color. The giant pink cloud, with chunks of the ruined fuel tank flashing in the sun, created headlines as it passed to the northeast over Louisiana and Mississippi. Meanwhile, government spokesmen tried to pooh-pooh it all as, quote, a natural phenomenon, unquote. The Bolsheviks here still are not quite sure what happened to the Columbia, but they do know that as far as space is concerned, the shuttle program is their only hope. They have 3 more orbital shuttles hidden away at White Sands, and they intend to launch them all no matter what the odds may be. So the NASA cover-up of the Columbia disaster went right on according to plan. 2 years ago, I first revealed the existence of man-made genetic replicas of human beings. I was widely disbelieved and condemned at the time, just as I knew I would be. But they do exist, and once again they have been pressed into service before our eyes. Tuesday morning, April 14, genetic replicas called synthetics of the late astronauts John Young and Robert Crippen were readied at White Sands. They were programmed to take a computerized ride on the training shuttle Enterprise. The Young and Crippen entities boarded the Enterprise, which was mounted on top of the Launch 747. After rocket fuel was loaded for the shuttle, the 747 took off and headed west, avoiding commercial air traffic. The Launch 747 headed out over the Pacific until it was several hundred miles west of Los Angeles. Then it turned back toward the east, toward the California coast. On television, we were told that the non-existent Columbia was re-entering from orbit. Meanwhile, the Enterprise, relabeled Columbia, cut loose from the 747 and fired its rockets. It sped up to a speed of nearly 6,000 miles per hour. Then we watched it as it made that dramatic race in from the sea to a precise computer landing at Edwards Air Force Base. It was all timed to agree as closely as possible with the official NASA timetable. Even so, a technical mistake was made that morning, and as a result we were told that the shuttle would land 6 minutes early. My friends, in spaceflight, 6 minutes might as well be a year. 6 minutes in orbit corresponds to nearly a 2,000-mile error in the location of the shuttle. But on TV nobody bothered to question it. They all just smiled and said, "Isn't it a lovely day to watch the shuttle?" After the dramatic shuttle landing, former astronaut Gene Cernan expressed surprise on ABC television. He said the shuttle simply did not look scorched enough for a ship that had re-entered from orbit. Likewise, when the synthetics called Young and Crippen emerged, they did not act like men who had been weightless for 2 days. Instead, they bounded down the access steps and pranced around with restless energy. But no one questioned it. After all, we had seen the shuttle landing for ourselves, and as that old saying goes, seeing is believing. Now it's time for my last-minute summary. My friends, the score in America's Space Shuttle program is now 1 down and 3 to go. 3 more shuttles like the Columbia are waiting their turn in the desert at White Sands. Each will have the name Columbia painted on its side. The real Columbia is now dead along with its crew, but thanks to these mechanical clones, the Columbia will live again in the public eye. I have given you as many details as time will allow about the Columbia disaster and its cover-up by NASA. The point of it all is not whether Russia is ahead or America is ahead in the space race. The point is that we are being deceived. We are being given a false sense of security and a false sense of confidence. We are being led like sheep to slaughter into nuclear war and Bolshevik dictatorship. If we choose to believe their lies, then they will succeed. They will destroy our way of life and enslave the few of us who survived their war. Or we can learn to do as our Lord Jesus Christ taught us to do long ago. We can learn to look for the truth, cherish the truth, and believe the truth. If we do that, my friends, then we will always be free. Until next month, God willing, this is Dr. Beter. Thank you, and may God bless each and every one of you. Hello, my friends. This is Dr. Beter. Today is April 27, 1981, and this is my audio letter number 64.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. We've gone for main engine start. We have main engine start. America's first space shuttle, and the shuttle has cleared the tower.
And that's how it all began, my friends, just 2 weeks ago, Sunday, April 12, 1981. After years of delay, America's first attempt to launch a space shuttle into orbit had finally begun. In days gone by, the voice of Mission Control has always been a familiar hallmark of American manned flights into space. In the early days, beginning with Project Mercury, the voice was that of Colonel John Shorty Powers. Later, during the Apollo program, there were other voices. But regardless of who it was, that familiar voice of Mission Control would always stay with us throughout each space flight. That is, until this time. This time the voice of Mission Control up until the moment of launch was that of NASA spokesman Hugh Harris. The last words Harris spoke as the voice of Mission Control were the words you just heard, standard brief cockpit scenes made by techniques which I will describe later. Just to make it look good, it was spiced up by telling us that a few non-critical tiles had fallen off. Otherwise, we were told over and over how perfectly the Columbia was performing. 4 days ago, on April 23, a news conference about the flight was held in Houston, Texas by the alleged 2 astronauts, John Young and Robert Crippen. The entity called John Young summed up the flight in words that were more meaningful than most people suspected. Referring to the falsified flight which we followed on television, he called it, quote, even better than normal, unquote. And so it was, my friends. The Bolsheviks who now control NASA bent over backwards to paint the image of an abnormally perfect shuttle flight. Meanwhile, the actual shuttle mission, which was carried out in secret, did not go according to plan. After the shuttle disappeared from our television screens, the flight continued for barely 4 more minutes before disaster struck. The Columbia never even reached Earth orbit. My friends, I believe you have both the right and the need to know what happened to the Space Shuttle Columbia 2 weeks ago. I believe you deserve to know in detail how and why the truth was hidden from you. The stakes involved nothing less. They were the sounds of the special NASA tape recording. For the first minute or so of the tape recording, we heard nothing but the sound effects simulating conversation between the shuttle and NASA Houston. Then for the first time we heard the anonymous new voice of Mission Control. It was no longer the familiar live voice of Hugh Harris, but the recorded voice of someone else. For added realism, the new voice was interrupted in turn by the recorded voice of the alleged capsule communicator Daniel Brandenstein. It sounded like this.
1 minute 45 seconds coming up on go, no, go. Columbia, your negative seats. That call up says that Columbia, the altitude is too high for ejection seat use.
By that point, the shuttle Columbia was more than 20 miles high and climbing fast. Everything was going according to plan so far, so the things we were hearing on the tape recording corresponded to what we were seeing. We could still see the shuttle on our TV sets, but it had dwindled to nothing more than 3 bright spots dancing in the distant sky. The last thing that you and I were able to see and verify for ourselves about the shuttle was the separation of those 2 giant solid rocket boosters. A little over 2 minutes after liftoff, we were able to watch the boosters, 2 burning bright spots. The shuttle has cleared the tower. Television cameras followed the shuttle as it climbed higher and higher on a column of steam and smoke. For another 30 seconds or so, we were allowed to hear the slowly fading roar of the shuttle's rocket engines. Then the sounds from Mission Control abruptly changed. Exactly 45 seconds after liftoff, live audio from Mission Control was terminated. In its place, NASA began feeding the radio and television networks an elaborate tape recording which had been prepared far ahead of time by NASA. The changeover from live audio to the NASA tape recording sounded like this.
Roger.
Just 45 seconds after liftoff, the falsified NASA coverage of the flight of the Columbia began. We were still able to see the Columbia by way of long-distance television cameras for another minute and a half, but the sounds we were hearing were no longer live, break-off to each side. That left only the single tiny flame of the shuttle itself, gradually fading into invisibility. Several seconds later, the NASA tape recording caught up with what we had already seen and said the boosters had separated. Moments later, the tiny bright dot of the shuttle faded from our screens. It was too far away for the television cameras to follow any longer. We had had our last look at the real Space Shuttle Columbia. In AUDIO LETTER 62 2 months ago, I gave an advance alert about the secret military mission of the Space Shuttle Columbia. At that time, I made public what the mission was really all about. I was also able to reveal what to expect in the falsified NASA coverage of the mission. The falsified coverage was designed to accomplish 2 purposes. First, to completely hide the military nature of the mission, and second, to make sure the mission looked like a total success, no matter what might happen in secret. As I detailed in AUDIO LETTER 62, The Bolsheviks here in the Federal Government are depending heavily on the Space Shuttle program to get ready for a nuclear war against Russia. The falsified NASA coverage of the mission of the Space Shuttle Columbia was carried out exactly according to plan. I revealed this plan 2 months ago. There were the